Hi everyone, this is Dr. Chris Calkins, and welcome to my presentation on culture and cultural competency. Let's start by defining culture. As you can see here, culture is influenced by many things, and in turn it also influences many things, if that makes sense. I think one of the best definitions I've seen is by Gilbert Good and Dunn, and that is an integrated pattern of human behavior that includes thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions of a racial, ethnic, religious, or other social groups. So building on our definition of culture, culture has many features. So the first is it's comparative. So you can compare one culture to another culture, and you can even compare a culture within itself. Culture shares common beliefs, customs, etc. within the group, and that group can share their cultures with others. Culture is holistic. That is, it incorporates a lot of things. So culture influences us in a lot of ways. It's not just healthcare. It's also our buying habits or vacation habits, or you name the different area of your life, culture can impact it. Culture is not genetic. It's that old nature versus nurture thing, and this is more the nurture, or how you grew up, or what you were exposed to. Culture can also happen later in life too. An example of that, as we move on to subcultures, is the culture of healthcare professionals, for example. And within healthcare professions, there's many subcultures. So if you're in emergency medical services, that's one subculture. You share common beliefs, practices, habits, things like that. Obviously, if you're in nursing, that's another culture. If you're a physician, etc., etc. So there's lots of subcultures. The gamer subculture is one. So people who have a shared interest in something. So there's all of these subcultures as well. So cultural competence, what is this anyway? Well, it's an indicator of attitudes, knowledge, and skills that enable effective cross-cultural practice. And that includes an expectation of continual growth and learning. It's important in many fields and disciplines where we help others. So that could be healthcare, law enforcement, customer service at a store even. It's also just plain old good for business, good for establishing rapport and respect. So there's many reasons why it's important to be culturally competent. It comes with a heightened consciousness of how culturally diverse populations experience their uniqueness and deal with their differences and similarities within the larger social context. It does require us to acknowledge our own positions of power in relation to the populations that we serve and to practice cultural humility, which I'll get to in a moment here. As I said before, it is an ongoing process. And it's not just a statement of quality of practice. It requires advocacy. So I alluded to cultural humility earlier, and now we get to explore it a little. So cultural humility is the attitude and practice of working with people at a micro, meso, and macro level with a presence of humility while learning, communicating, offering help, and making decisions in professional practice and settings. So what are these micro, meso, macro levels? I'm glad you asked. So micro level is helping people on a individual level or practicing cultural humility on an individual level. Meso refers to groups of people, and macro is the bigger picture, the society as a whole. And cultural humility really includes a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation. Intersectionality is the next topic of discussion. So we all belong to various groups. So I am Welsh. So I would identify with perhaps a Welsh group or the Welsh culture. I'm also male, so I would identify with that culture. I am a paramedic. I identify with that culture. And on and on and on. I'm married. I have a certain level of education. I have hobbies. I like to do fencing. So these are things that can create lots of different overlap and kind of an enmeshing of different groups one belongs to. So it would be indeed unusual to find somebody who belongs to only one group. Likely impossible. An intersectionality approach to practice at the micro, meso, and macro levels, like we talked about before, includes integrating the various diversity components and identities that you can see here, and approaching from a holistic point of view. So, for example, a healthcare provider would approach a first-generation patient in the context of the patient's families, and with recognition of the person's race, ethnicity, religion, spiritual expression, social class, sexual orientation, abilities, and you get the idea, all the other factors. Intersectionality theory emphasizes human behavior in social environments. So an intersectionality perspective provides a comprehensive approach from a common base of knowledge and practice. Now time for your crash course in anthropological terms. So the first one is ethnocentrism. And I think this is important for those in helping professions. So the cartoon really pretty much says it all. And it's really thinking that your own values, beliefs, customs, habits, and the things that make your culture unique are better than someone else's. Maybe you think your food's better, for example. That's an example of ethnocentrism. Next is cultural relativism, and that's judging a culture to our own standards of what is right or wrong, strange or normal. Instead, we should try to understand cultural practices of other groups in their own cultural context. So the next thing we'll talk about is cultural discourse. So just put simply, it's what are in our respective cultures, what are we talking about? What are we discussing? Our discourse shapes the culture we're in, and our culture informs what we're talking about or the discourse. And cultural discourse can be good, bad, indifferent. It can be communicated in many ways. So things are communicated through art. They're communicated through literature, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, or even through our media. It can be communicated through film and theater and music and all these different kinds of ways, as well as person to person individually or meetings or anything. So the bad part of it is that cultural discourse can lead to something called otherization. So seeing people in terms that they're different or somehow inferior, or in worst cases like evil or bad, when they're not. And this can lead to obviously significant societal problems. So in the way of an example, we in my profession of emergency medical services, we bring people into the hospital, or we talk about our patients to another healthcare provider, and either we or the other person will refer to a patient as their malady. So, for example, put the hip in room 5. You're going on a psych. Those kinds of things. And that's an otherization, a depersonalization, so that we can relegate that person to some otherness. Now, sometimes we need to do that as a protective measure, but it's when it becomes what we call compassion fatigue that it's really a problem. I always tell people, go ahead, build up the wall. It's okay to build it up a little bit, but you better not put so many bricks in your wall that you can't see over it, because then you get compassion fatigue. The other thing is stigma. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Thomas Joyner, who is a suicidologist, he defines stigma as fear plus ignorance as stigma, and stigma can result in people being treated differently based on, in a negative way, based on various things, whether it's socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, those disability, those kinds of things. So in my search for the ideal set of standards for cultural competence, the one that I've favored the best so far is the National Association of Social Workers Statements and Standards. And it consists of 10 things you can see here. The first is ethics and values, and that is we should function in accordance with the values, ethics, and standards of our own professional code of ethics. In any profession you're in, that profession, whether it's emergency medical services, law enforcement, etc., has some kind of code of ethics, statements of values. You can find this in corporations too. There's often codes of conduct. Next is self-awareness. It requires cultural humility that we talked about before, and the commitment to understanding and embracing culture is essential to our effective practice. We should be aware of our own culture as well as the privilege and power within that, and acknowledge the impact of privilege and power in our work with and on behalf of others. So that's a mouthful, but what does it mean? What's an example? So I like to take cruises. That's a privilege I have because of my socioeconomic status related to my occupational group, and not everybody can do that, and I need to recognize there are limitations that others have because of cultures or subcultures that they belong to and the associated things with those cultures. It could be lack of funds, it could be discriminatory practices, it could be a lot of things. Power imbalance is the other thing. So as a paramedic, I am seen as the professional, I hope, by my patients. They trust that I'm going to do the right thing, that I know what I'm doing, and they're open to my suggestions, recommendations, and that creates a power imbalance that I could use for good or evil. So on to cross-cultural knowledge. We need to demonstrate, again, our appreciation of our own cultural identity. Who are we? And who are the others that we're serving? And have we taken that time to understand that other culture or cultures? Next are cross-cultural skills. We should use a broad range of skills and techniques and demonstrate an understanding of and respect for the importance of culture in practice, policy, and research. And I know everybody thinks like I can't do anything about policy or research because I'm a quote-unquote peon, those kinds of things. But you can advocate for that, and you can suggest that, and you could see the value in it and be part of a culture change. Next is service delivery. We should be knowledgeable about and skillful in the use of services, resources, and institutions, and be available to serve multicultural communities. And we should be able to make culturally appropriate referrals within both the formal and informal networks that we have, and be aware of and work to address service gaps affecting specific cultural groups. Next is empowerment and advocacy. We need to be aware of the impact of social systems, policies, practices, and programs on a multicultural basis for different populations. So we need to advocate for, with, and on behalf of multicultural populations whenever is appropriate. And we should participate in the development and implementation of policies and practices that empower and advocate for marginalized populations. Next is professional education. We should advocate for, develop, and participate in professional education and training programs that advance cultural competence within our own profession. When's the last time you've been to an in-service, one that was actually worthwhile on cultural competence? I think a lot of times we talk the talk, but we don't walk the walk, or we punch the card of you have to talk about this, that, or the other, address these things, but do we take the time to provide a quality educational experience and really allow people to internalize that with examples and ways that they can apply the knowledge and understand better? Next is language and communication. We should provide and advocate for effective communications with people of all cultural groups, including those with limited English proficiency or low literacy skills. Even people who are blind or have low vision are a group that may need to be advocated for, and people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and those with disabilities. And last is leadership to advance cultural competence. We should be change agents. We need to demonstrate leadership skills to work effectively with many different cultural groups and agencies, organizational settings, and communities. We often treat others outside our organization like we treat ourselves internally. And we should demonstrate responsibility for advancing cultural competence within and beyond our organization, helping to challenge structural and institutional barriers and build and sustain diverse and inclusive institutions and communities. So it's an action thing. Again, we need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Throughout this presentation, I've made reference to a lot of different people and organizations. Here are some of the references that I've made for those who have inquiring minds and a need to know. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm hoping you got some important information out of this presentation. Feel free to contact me if you need anything, or visit me on the web at www.freerangethinker.org.